So today I wanted to talk about the properties of a system needs to represent and process human language. So I'll present the labors of love of my research group and wax poetic a bit about what I think all these things might mean, both for the human system, but also for artificial systems that might be interested in representing language or coming in contact with it. But let me start by explaining my title a little bit. I can get my slides to advance. Right. Okay, so we can define a space of systems that can have language, and we can describe that with a differential equation, and then try to find the conditions under which we can find a solution for that equation. And it's those conditions that I want to go after today, but I'm going to talk about them conceptually. So the important notion here is that we can divide systems that can have language and those that can't by defining these boundary conditions or the solution to the boundary value problem that delineates these two spaces. So then the question can become a little bit more accessible, as in what properties do you need to fall into a space of systems that can have something like human language or human language and systems that can't. And I find that's a sort of accessible way of delineating the problem. But already here you can see it gets tough because, spoiler, turns out that human language is put forth and utilized by the human brain. That's a frustratingly complicated system if there ever was one. So now I need to talk about the disconnect between the most basic aspects of these two systems, so neuroscience and language science. We don't know how to connect the dots here, but the work of many people over the last 40 years has taken really important steps in trying to do that, trying to bring the concepts in these different disciplines together so that they either have an identity relation or they're at least transducible. So what I mean to highlight here is, despite all the progress that we've made in brain and language and cognitive sciences, of which there's much to be glad of, don't get me wrong there's still this persistent gap to be filled. And that gap requires us then to transduce concepts where they can be transduced. So I want to make the case for trying to do that, trying to fill that gap between concepts and different disciplines, but to do it earnestly, even if that means we do it in a very piecemeal way. And I think the way to do that is by cleaving to the minimal formal facts that we know about language, that is formal linguistics, but also what facts we know about computation and neural systems. So I'll obviously talk more about this for the rest of the talk. All right, but now for today's audience, the problem actually explodes in scale as we add other relevant fields and their own taxonomies. I don't actually mean this as a criticism, I just mean this as an accurate description of the problem. Now, how do we get our dots to align when we add more fields and their taxonomies and the meanings of their jargon? Not to say that any of those jargons are less legitimate, but now we have a problem where we really need to align what we mean by terms in our different fields. But I think, again, we have to sort of go back to the basics and start with what we do know about language. So what we know about language is that what we know matters. We know that associations, statistical regularities, and predictions are important both in language and description of language, and also in the brain. So for example, we know that priming is robust across multiple levels of linguistic representation, that language acquisition and development are exquisitely sensitive to statistical and distributional information. We know that in everyday life, things like speaker adaptation showcase the exquisite ability of the brain to do fast and effective statistical adaptation. And then we have all these classic effects from psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics that really emphasize that point. And then it's sort of more practically in our research lives, but also in our daily life when we use any kind of smartphone or any other language technology, we know that closed probability, surprisal, and entropy are very they really add a lot and they matter a lot for language processing. But the important thing here is that I'm listing all these things. These are widely researched, right? These are sort of core things we always think about when we do our research. And that's fine. We know the statistics of our world. But what I want to highlight today is that we also know more than that. And that's, I think, where a lot of the interesting action lies. So the ne plus ultra of what we know as humans, especially when it comes to language, is structure and meaning. So I'll illustrate more how that's different in a second, but we as a species seem to know how to make structure and meaning in pretty much any context. So you take these, the phrase itself, complex structure and meaning, and the identical sequence of words can easily come to mean two different things. That's because of the hidden structure of language and the fact that language is compositional, so it can be built up and broken down into parts. So this is an elegant, awful cartoon of these structures, but it illustrates the point that in the first tree, the noun, structure, and meaning are separated in the tree structure with their own individual branch. And the adjective complex only modifies structure. So we get the meaning complex structure, but not complex meaning. And it's that scope taking of meaning over constituent structure that I think, not to do a spoiler of my own point, these are the kind of things that we really struggle to know how to represent in a neural system like the brain. Right, so I've circled the part in red of the structure that gets the meaning complex in both cases. So this is a basic, very simple ambiguity. So in the second case, the nouns share a branch in the structure, so they both get predicated by complex. And so this is, again, all from an identical string of words. And the point here is that you have to have a difference in underlying structure to get these different meanings. Of course, language is infinitely interesting. You can think of situations where you don't have that. You can also have ambiguity without that per se, especially in discourse. But in any case, what I want to highlight here is that we need to think about how we're bringing in notions of linguistic structure, veridical or not, cartoon or not, even cartoon is better than nothing, into our theories of language and language processing in the brain. And so that's really what I'm worried about. But I think also that's a big issue for anyone working on artificial systems as well. So in other words, not only are the formal descriptions at stake, but how we use them to inform our approach is at stake as well. Okay, but the short answer is we all struggle with this. We don't do it so much. So as we all know from daily life, tools like autocorrect and Google Translate and language models, they don't always get language right. They often miss core aspects. And in the extreme, this can even be dangerous. But I think there's actually an interesting signal here. The reason why language models often don't get it right is maybe because of how claims about representation or linguistic representation are made in these models. And that's in the limit as a sequence of associations, no matter how high dimensional or conditionalized, whether you relate one word to another or the probability of one word given another or any kind of distributional representation, any way you go, as long as you're not sort of cleaving to the fact that you have to represent a structure or a grammar, although now I will say Pache RNN grammars. The point is, if you take a statistics only approach, you miss out on what's miraculous about language. And that's that we can understand things that are not highly probable or predicted. We can understand things that we haven't heard before. For example, like the phrase, a marmoset getting a toothbrush head rub. So I can't be sure, but it's unlikely that you've ever heard that particular phrase before, marmoset getting a toothbrush head rub, unless you've seen a version of this talk. I try to change it up though. But I can be sure, and this is the important point, that it was not a predictable utterance for you to hear in that moment. And the point is, models based on associations alone can't and do not explain how we do this, nor do they explain how we say things that are novel or unexpected, or even just variants of what we've heard before. So it's obvious that statistical association and prediction are really important, and we need to include them, but they can't be the whole story. Yet, the dominant models in psychology and neuroscience and artificial intelligence are all based mostly on association, right? Not really on structure. There's some commitments that you make when you make a control structure, but that's not the point I'm getting at here. It's the reliance heavily on association that gets us into a bit of a pickle, I think. So since structure is what explains how we know what a toothbrush head rub is, it highlights that this is a problem. And actually, I think it comes down to, if you really want to like strip everything away and look at the bare fact that's driving all of these worries, it's the fact that language is mathematically quite interesting. So it's an example of a system that's both algebraic and statistical, and we don't pay enough attention to that wondrous fact. In fact, the mathematician, Dr. Tidane Bradley, who works on category theory, among other things, has really, I think, hit the nail on the head here in her thesis, and she says it much more succinctly than many in our field managed to. She says, language is algebraic since words can be combined to form longer expressions, but language is also statistical since some expressions occur more frequently than others. That's just summation of the problem and a great series of sentences there to me. But anyway, I'm mentioning it here so you can check out her blog for accessible and insightful lessons in category theory and other mathematical formalisms for language. So her pithy observation leads to what I see as the main challenge for accounts of language processing in the brain. And that's really the fact that we don't know, where to begin, for example, on how to represent a constituent, but we also don't know so much about how to represent the statistical knowledge we have about language either. So we've got a bunch of problems for us, but rather than seeing that as frustrating, I try to see that as inspiring. So, for example, there's already so much from basic linguistic theory and from psychology that's not earnestly incorporated into computational and neurobiological work on language yet. And I think that that's what we have to do to make progress. So today I'm going to try to outline an approach that can be summarized as trying to transduce concepts from different areas that I've mentioned to constrain other areas in order to fill that gap, right? So that means when I'm considering the kind of models and theories that I'm building, I want to be faithful to key basic properties of formal linguistics. And like I said, even in the most piecemeal way. So for me, like really, what is the notion of a constituent is enough for now, because it's hard. I also want to be faithful to tenets of psycholinguistics and psychology, right? So I don't want to give up incrementality, for example, or the importance of timing in processing or other tenets from psycholinguistics. Of course, you know, when I want to bring in now the sort of constraining lens of a computational cognitive science, one of the big things is to be computationally tractable. But that, I have to say, everyone has that problem. So that is a problem for another day. But also be neurobiologically and neurophysiologically informed. And for me, that means really looking at brain rhythms as the primary currency of neural computation. And I'll get to that more in a second. So here are the spoilers about the rest of what I'm going to talk about today. So how do we do this constraint and transduction? So again, like I said, it's by using what we know has to be there in the formal description of linguistic structure and the processing tenets of psychology and neuroscience and computation all at the same time. So it's a tall order. So questions like what minimal claims about representations have to be incorporated. So as I've said so far in this introduction, we have to have structure and statistics. We don't really know how to represent either yet, but there's promising ways forward on that. We want to ground whatever models we build to apply to brain activity. And we can do that either on the formal level, but also on the conceptual level. And we want to realize, or at least for me, this is the big spoiler, I think that linguistic structure is realized in the dynamics of neural networks in the brain and in models. So there you go. Okay, right. So this is also where I'd like to focus a little bit more on practice. So this approach that I'm advocating stipulates that you start with the capacity to be explained. That is, the capacity is to have a system like human language. You can also define that in other ways. You can say the capacity to be compositional, or the capacity to be productive, or the capacity to have systematicity. There are different ways you can do that. But then, of course, this inches closer to the elephant in the room, which is, what is an explanation in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience? So to me, the modeling endeavor is really about trying to establish the first principles of the neural system that has a capacity for human language. So we want a model that explains how language and language behavior arises, not a system that's based on implausible principles that can mimic anything through statistical approximation. It's even more important given multiple realizability and its cousin Kolmogorov complexity, the fact that there's just not a valid inference that just because the system returns X or computes X, that it's done it in the same way that the human mind or brain has. So I think we fall into this fallacy a lot in our computational approaches to the brain more broadly, but also computational approaches to language. Okay, so this leaves us with a developing approach to our theoretical and computational models that are trying to stay faithful to the formal facts about language and the brain. So I'll start from the principle that brain computations are extended in time and are distributed across neural networks. And it's the dynamics of those networks that reflect their computation in which linguistic structure can be expressed. So now I'm going to devote the rest of the talk trying to show instances of this in different domains. Okay. So each subsection is going to apply constraints from one domain onto the other. So the first section is going to be about using time in a neural network to encode structure. So to be pithy, we know a lot about how brain circuits involved in understanding language light up or come online, but not much about the computations and processes that are implemented in those networks that lead to the generation of structure. But representing structure isn't simple, and we as language researchers aren't the only ones in cognitive science who face this difficult problem. So we can learn a lot, I think, from how other disciplines have faced it, even if the structures that they try to represent are not injective with linguistic structure yet. But nonetheless, I think we have to face it. So to perceive the difference in the example I had at the beginning, complex structure and meaning, you likely exploited grammatical cues, like the rhythm and intonation in my speech, or in the sign of interpreters, if we had interpreters, to map incoming speech or sign into the grammatical structures and resulting meanings that your brain builds. And it's likely that we do this by combining our internal knowledge of language with speech or sign as it comes in. But where are we starting from? Essentially, all we have is bursts of energy in time, in space-time. So that's bursts of energy in speech, movements across space-time and sign that we perceive as a sequence of words, morphemes, phonemes, and words in time. So it's not surprising that psychological models of language processing always stress the importance of timing and rhythm in perceiving structure and meaning. So timing, rhythm, and prosody are critical for generating structure. These are ancient ideas in psycholinguistics, by the way, but they're seldom taken up in computational models and neurobiological theories. But they're starting to be, and there are also important historical exceptions. So here I want to advocate that we should all systematically exploit time and rhythm in processing and computation in order to understand how structure can be uncovered and represented in a neural system. But first, a quick primer on brain rhythm. So already we can see that we need to incorporate a constraint from psychology, time and rhythm, and now we need to think about how that makes us understand neural signals relating to language in a different way. So we can incorporate constraints from neuroscience at the same time. So the brain computes with distributed neural networks that cycle in and out of activation for various reasons. So we can see here what I'm showing you is, again, a cartoon of raw EEG in its various phase and power. And you might see then how this cartoon was originally used to contribute, to show how these raw signals contribute to classically measured signals like event-related brain potentials. That's what you see at the bottom of the screen. The point is that brain rhythms contain more and different information to the averaged event-related potential that we typically used for a long period in language processing in the brain. But the brain is inherently rhythmic in its processing, and speech is also quasi-rhythmic. So by asserting that time and computation over time are important for the system, we can get a step closer in accounting for how linguistic structure could be formed in the mind and brain. Actually, can we use the fact that we've got these two rhythmic signals? We've got the inherent rhythmicity of neural processing in the brain and the quasi-rhythmic nature of speech. Can these come together? And could we actually come up with an account of structure that exploits these two facts? So now I'll tell you about a single example of this constrained approach. So based on this highly influential study from Neiding and colleagues in 2016 that used synthesized speech and a continuous stimulation paradigm where synthesized syllables were presented at an isochronous fixed rate of 1/4 of a second, which results in a 4 Hertz signal. This remarkable result that you see here is that the brain shows peaks in spectral power at 1 and 2 Hertz, even though there's nothing in the physical signal at those frequencies. And you can see that by comparing B, which is the spectrogram shows you the power at 4 Hertz in the physical signal of the stimulation, the synthesized speech. If you compare that to A, which is the annotation of the linguistic structure that is perceived from that 4 Hertz signal, compared to C, which is where you see the peaks at 1, 2, and 4 Hertz from the actual MEG data. So they argued that this pattern reflects the cortical tracking of words, phrases, and sentences. But then, nonetheless, you can get this readout. But how is it that these phrases and sentences are being generated? Is the brain just tracking their timing? Or is this actually a signal of how they're being computed? So in other words, what's causing this 1 and 2 Hertz readout? So we asked if a computational model that uses time to bind information and gives off oscillations as it computes would reproduce the signal when it processes the same sentence. And note this is completely inductive. So this is one way that the problem could be solved. And the work I'm describing to you was developed in collaboration with Alex Dumas, my good friend and collaborator at the University of Edinburgh. And the background that goes into this model forms a completely different talk. And it's a wonderful topic to go into, but it's too long actually to be embedded in another talk. But the short rendition that I'll give in a second, as I mentioned earlier, is that we can get value from other areas of cognitive science that have faced the structured representations in a neural network problem before. They wanted to solve it for other reasons, like being able to perform relational reasoning and analogy. But John Hummel and Alex Dumas have pioneered this symbolic connectionist tradition, which represents, to my mind, a really great synthesis of what's often seen as a great ontological and epistemological divide between whole feature-based whole object representations versus structured representations. You can sort of carve that up as sort of traditional connectionist approaches versus symbolic approaches. But these can actually be fused together. And this has culminated in a model called DORA, or the discovery of relations by analogy, which is descended from Lisa. So Lisa was the first way to represent a predicate calculus in a neural network, but Lisa doesn't learn the representations from unstructured feature vectors, while Dora does. In any case, both of these models are made to be models of relational reasoning and analogy, and been largely used to simulate a large literature now of behavioral tasks and their developmental trajectory. That's the other important contribution of Dora. Clearly, it's a symbolic connectionist model. As I said already, so early symbolic connectionist models like Lisa were really focused on how do you represent a symbolic system in a neural network, so not so much on how do you get it in there. And Dora was interested in ultimately getting to that predicate calculus, but how do you get there from having no structure at all? So like I said, a wonderful other topic for another day, how Dora learns a predicate calculus from unstructured feature vectors. But today I'll just focus on the sort of high level version to tell you how Dora, the key way is that Dora is different from a typical connectionist network that allows it to have this capacity. And that's that it's a settling network with layers of units. So it's really focused on how do we get the representations tuned inside the network, not so much on the input-output mapping. It needs to have functionally separable banks of units, just that you can control the flow of activation and inhibition in that floating set. It uses the Hebbian learning rule. And the important, usually I have something that's highlighted here. The most important thing here is that it's the sensitivity to time as an informational degree of freedom that gets you this ability to sort of tease information apart and achieve variable value independence. And that comes from being able to control lateral inhibition and integrative inhibitors at different time scales. I'm happy to talk more about that some other day. Okay, so we asked if a computational model that uses time to bind information and gives off oscillations, a rhythmic computational phases as it computes would reproduce the signal when it processed the same sentence. So here is a simulation of the Ding et al. 2016 data using Dora compared to an RNN. So here, the blue line represents the human data and the dotted red spikes are the activation of Dora. We also use an RNN, which doesn't use time or structure in the same way, and that's shown in black. And so both models performed to the same criterion in predicting the next word, which is a standard performance metric, as you know. But the RNN didn't produce functional structures or oscillations in order to achieve that benchmark, but Dora did. So they both performed equally well at predicting the next word, but Dora achieved that in a very different way, in a way that looks more like the MEG data that was observed from humans. So this suggests that brain rhythms could reflect the building of words, the binding of words, and the building of phrase structures over time. Hello, slides. Okay, some kind of memory issues here. So the takeaway here from this section of the talk is that to go from a sequential input to a structure and to give off oscillations, right? That's the constraint from neuroscience. At the same time as you do that, one candidate mechanism is to use a time-based binding approach, and that means that we've constrained neurophysiology writ large by time cycles of computation. We've gotten an aspect of structure that's a step towards getting linguistic structures or precursors to that as such, as seen as in these predicate structures that we've achieved in the neural network. So it's a beginning look on how perceiving structure from a sequence might result in the neural readout that we observe. All right, now on to the next part of the section. So now we want to ask, can we observe the modulation of brain rhythms related to linguistic structure? This would be further evidence that there is an undeniable link between structures that we observe in language and modulations of brain rhythms. And we want to see that in response to structure and meaning over and above the brain's response to the physical aspects of the stimulus, such as sentence prosody and also the speech envelope and lexical content. So what I'm telling you about now is the PhD work of Greta Caulfield, who has recently graduated, so Dr. Greta Caulfield. Here we asked whether the mutual information between the brain response and the stimulus, so here naturally produced speech, increases a function of linguistic content. So Greta came up with these wonderful stimuli in 3 conditions. So we have something called prosodic Jabberwocky that has sentence prosody, and the modulation spectra between the prosodic Jabberwocky and the sentence condition are indistinguishable. So we have a typical sentence or a well-produced sentence like timid heroes pluck flowers and brown birds gather branches. And then we have a Dutch-like looking non-word version that's produced with the same prosody. And I won't try to torture you with me producing that. We had trained people who are trained in diction and speaking who were able to record all of these for us. And then we have a wordless condition that has all the target words of interest, but not in a way that can easily form phrases or sentences. Okay. So what we found is that brain rhythms track linguistic structure, even when you control for the effect on the brain from the prosodic, acoustic, and lexical properties of speech. So Greta showed that when you cut up the brain response into phrase length, word length, and syllable length parts, as you see in the columns of this plot, that on the timescale of words and phrases, the brain is more attuned to linguistic structure than to prosodically and lexically matched control. So you see this by looking at the fact that the sentence condition, the green dot and its distribution, are always higher than the orange, the prosodic control, and the purple, the lexical control. Okay, and this begins to show that it's not just acoustic, prosodic, or lexical properties of work that are driving this tracking response. Moreover, this pattern is true even when we used a hyper-reduced annotation of structure, suggesting that we don't even have to model the fine detail of the acoustic response, which we spend a lot of time controlling for and making sure they were physically as identical as possible. We didn't even actually need to do that, we show with this analysis, because with this minimally reduced annotation, we can still detect the role of structure in shaping the brain response. But there's more mutual information between the annotation and the brain data when the structure is present versus when it's not. All right, so to sum up that other section, we showed that sentences, the most structured and compositional thing that we tested, organized the brain rhythmic response the most beyond acoustic and prosodic control, so beyond timing and frequency match controls. And it suggests that this tracking that has been observed more and more as literature grows really is about linguistic content and not just the timing or time scale that it occurs on alone. So I just told you that phrases are tracked more strongly when they're meaningful and bear linguistic content, but what aspects of linguistic content are we talking about? And what aspects of linguistic content affect the tracking of phrases in natural speech? And this is now the work of my PhD student, Cas Koopmans, who set out to answer this question. So we've shown just now, I've told you about how neuroactivity can track temporal regularities in speech, but there's a rich literature showing this. Even when those regularities are abstract and have to be inferred. But abstract phrases are tracked more strongly when they bear linguistic content, as we just saw. But again, what does this mean? What aspects? So to this end, Cuss created an experimental design with a parametric modulation of linguistic content, comparing sentences to idioms, to syntactic prose, to Jabberwocky sentences and wordless. I'll tell you a bit more about these complex conditions. So basically, all the conditions except for Jabberwocky have lexical semantics. So the Jabberwocky is the only condition that uses Dutch pseudo words. So these are words that obey the phonotactics of Dutch, but otherwise don't have a nearest neighbor that's immediately called to mind or something like that. Then all conditions except for the word list have the same syntactic structure. But it's only the sentences that have the meaningful combination of word meanings such that their phrase structure yields a compositional interpretation that's meaningful. It's also possible to derive compositional interpretations of idioms. It's another important condition, and syntactic prose and Jabberwocky, but these interpretations are either not the intended meaning, or as in the case of idiom. So if you try to compose an idiom sort of step-by-step compositionally, you don't get the intended meaning. So I'll give you just a quick English example. So if you use the idiom kick the bucket, which means to die or pass away, you don't get that from kicking a bucket or directly combining kick the bucket. Okay, so that's the important contribution of that condition there. This again, all in Dutch. So in the case of idioms, you can do composition, but you don't get the intended meaning or the meaning that people perceive. Or if you do composition in these other conditions, so in the syntactic prose, for example, you get semantically odd or underspecified meaning. And Jabberwocky, you could imagine there's definitely some syntactic composition going on there. So you sort of know that there's a subject and a verb, but there's no sort of lexical content to perform the operation over. So those are the important differences between these conditions. And again, Cuss really wanted to use these conditions to try to get at, okay, what is this neural readout that we're getting really mean? Because what we confront more and more is, as we're trying to build our models and theories, what we're also missing is a theory of our readouts, a theory of our data. So in any case, okay, right. So for each recording, Cuss manually annotated the onsets and offsets of the syntactic phrases and converted these annotations to the average frequency at which the phrases were presented. He also annotated each stimulus to know how many syntactic phrases are closed at each word. That's the so-called bracket count that's highly used across literature. And we use the annotation of bracket count as an abstract representation of syntax, which doesn't contain acoustic information. So he extended this work again, looking both at speech tracking and syntax tracking. So the two conditions which have less straightforward one-to-one relationship between structure and meaning are idioms and syntactic prose. And we find stronger mutual information between sentences in both syntactic prose and Jabberwocky sentences. That's in the speech tracking. So when we compute mutual information between the EEG signal and the abstract annotations of bracket count, we find stronger mutual information for sentences than for Jabberwocky and word lists, but no difference between sentences and idioms or between sentences and syntactic prose. So at first, these findings seem to suggest the meaning of the stimuli doesn't reflect cortical tracking, that is the signal that we can measure, of phrase structure. So in order to check whether participants did notice the differences between these conditions that differ so wildly in the meaning that we perceive, and as you can see then is an index of compositional output, we computed the event-related potentials elicited by the sentence final word in all the syntactically structured conditions. And these findings show that the N for 100 to the sentence final word in sentences is smaller than the N for 100 for both prose and Jabberwocky, but larger than the N for 100 for idioms. So these ERP findings suggest that participants did notice the semantic differences between conditions. In other words, despite clear differences between conditions and the extent to which compositional interpretation of the sentences yields a sensible semantic interpretation, the clear differences in terms of the ERP at the sentence final word are there, suggesting that this is the output of the process and the outcome of the process. But these differences didn't seem to affect the ongoing cortical tracking of phrase structure throughout the presentation of the sentence. And we thought that was really interesting. Okay, so to sum up, Costa's work as an answer to the question of which aspects of linguistic content affect cortical tracking of phrase structure, we suggest that it's the properties of the input to the structure building operation that affects the tracking response, not the compositional interpretation of its output. So this conclusion is in line with models in which cortical tracking of linguistic structure reflects the generation of that structure, and models of language processing in which structure building is a partially lexicalized process. So it's not, the tracking is not necessarily indexing the output of the operation or the computation, but rather the ongoing building up of that computation or the input to structure building. All right, okay. Now to sort of pivot, but within the same sort of subsection of or line of inquiry, we want to better understand how these internal representations are shaping ongoing processing of an incoming stimulus. So in other words, what is the notion of our internal language model? How is it shaping the processing of speech? So the way that we can ask this question is we can say, does the brain represent phrases and sentences when they're forced to take up the same amount of time? So when we again, as Greta did, and as Custard as well, try to make the stimuli as physically identical as possible, what can we then learn about the readout in order to make inferences about our model? So this is the PhD work of Fan Bai, a student in my group, and he compared synthesized speech stimuli that were exactly the same length in time, but composed a phrase or a sentence. So something like the ball is blue versus the blue ball, which in Dutch is the same number of syllables. And funded a lot of work to show that the stimuli are as physically comparable as we could make them, while keeping them good examples of phrases and sentences to native speakers. So you can see here that the cosine similarity between the envelope is always greater than 0.9. It's the same number of syllables, the same duration, and the correlation in like the root mean squared power is also 0.9. So they're as physically similar as you can get. And what Fun found was that the phase synchronization between sentences and phrases were clearly different. And that's with there being more phase synchronization for sentences than for phrases. So this is a coarse-grained prediction of a system organized the way Dora is, where phase sets are distributed codes that fire in a temporal pattern with one another. For example, a word in relation to another word that are both in relation to a phrasal node or representation. That the sentences here have more of those phase set phrasal relationships than the phrase, for example, does. So there are more constituents in the ball is blue than the blue ball. That's another way to think about it. So the organization of the neural assemblies, in as much as that can be reflected in phase synchronization measured at the scalp, is increased for sentences even when they take the same amount of time or have the same envelope shape as a phrase. So Fan is also working with encoding models of the neural response during speech and language comprehension. And he's got good separability now by hemisphere and by whether a phrase or a sentence was presented. So notably, he could get the separation on these encoding models only with the theta and delta bands, and which were better predictors than chance, and no other band was. So this suggests that, as we know from very large literature, that theta and delta play key roles for the brain's processing of phrases and sentences from speech. And finally, Fun wanted to examine one of the clearest predictions of existing models of speech processing by neural oscillations. That's the Giraud and Popel model from 2012, which says that phase amplitude coupling, that's a relationship between the phase and power across frequency bands theta and gamma, is crucial for segmenting syllables and decoding phonemes from speech. So here we actually find no difference between theta gamma coupling for phrases and sentences, but we do find increased theta gamma coupling when participants were listening to speech compared to resting state. So that shows that theta gamma coupling is important for speech processing, but doesn't seem to be sensitive to higher level aspects of language processing. All right, so this sort of portion of the talk of this work looking at the relationship between brain rhythms and linguistic structure is consistent with the principle for endogenous brain rhythms as proposed in this list of recent papers here, where signals appear more rhythmic coming off of the brain or in the neural readout, despite the pseudorhythmicity of speech, due to contributions from an internally generated set of linguistic representations. So the way I like to think about it is that you've got an internal language model that's using perceptual inference, cue-based perceptual inference, and when it gets a sufficient physiological signal about speech or sign to infer the presence of a word or morpheme, it can then build these up and do more inference to eventually build up linguistic structures based on its knowledge of language, the internal language model, which was derived from experience. All right, so now we're going to transition to the last two sections of the talk quickly. So one is the using constraints from psychology to constrain computational models, so bringing time into an internal language model in an oscillating neural network, so still also with our neuroscience constraint. And then I'll synthesize everything and talk about a formalism developed by a student in my group and then my own model. Okay, so Dr. Sanatan Ufer, postdoc in my group, has started working on a modeling of corpus of a big spoken corpus of Dutch stimuli. So these are conversations recorded during customer service calls, so full of natural speech. And Sana is interested in explaining how timing and speech and computation relate. So her ultimate goal is to try to relate the model she's developing to neural data from natural speech, but she has to start with developing that model. So far she's begun by incorporating linguistic structural constraints as feedback in an RNN. And these constraints were extracted from a spoken corpus. And at the same time, she's going to force some neuroscientific principles on the model, giving inhibition, giving it an internal rhythm of cycles of computation that mimic how the brain computes in time. And she wants to see if adding these two principles from neuroscience can change how processing works in these networks. Right, so I'm getting all of my animations here. Or maybe it's my next text. Here we go. So I'll do these animations again in a second. So here, the aspects of these properties from neuroscience, we want to see if they help explain how the brain can handle the pseudorhythmicity in speech. So we know that amplitude modulations of syllables always fall within 48 hertz, the theta range, but we can also find these theta rhythms in the brain. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily related in a one-to-one way. And speech isn't isochronous such that you can exactly predict the onset time based on temporal features. So it's an open question how we can track it at all. And it could involve aligning highly excitable neuronal phases with important moments in the speech signal. But what's rarely been considered in speech tracking is how that pseudorhythmicity could be a consequence of the content of speech. And so that's what Sana wants to do, is to try to figure out how can you align the contents of speech with neural oscillations, given the fact that it's not isochronous. So in a recent paper, we investigated whether words that were predictable in sentences, in a sentence context, had a shorter word-to-word onset difference. And to do this, we correlated word-to-word onset differences with predictability of the word in the context as estimated by an RNN. And we found a negative relationship. So that means that words are shorter when the next word is predictable, but longer when the next word is less predictable. And now my animations have stopped working. All right, yes, there we go. Okay, got some memory issues here. So then how can we add these content predictions to the oscillatory tracking models? We can use a model with the following components: a stimulus input. So it's a main level processing words and consisting of oscillations, feedback, and inhibition. And the feedback, again, comes from predictions of that we extracted from the corpus. And we can present this model with a sentence like, I eat. The sentence has a different next word prediction. It can be either I eat cake, which is very predictable, or I eat nice cake, or I eat really nice cake, which is less predictable. And this is the output of the model. And as you can see, the sensory input is I eat. And at the feedback level, after the word eat, 3 nodes get feedback, but at different strengths. When we look at the final activation of the model, we can see that the oscillation gets the most excitable phase that is more red. First, the most predictable word from the node cake is active, followed by other nodes, creating a phase code of predictability. And if this model can explain recent behavioral effects showing different categorization depending on the phase of presentation, but crucially, the model needs all components to achieve what it does. Again, let's see if we advance. Here we go. So we get a stronger rhythmic response from the RNN, from the computational model using the predictions from the RNN, when we use an input timing that matches the internal model's predictions. So interestingly, again, that's aligning these two things. When combined with the internal model making onset predictions and an endogenous oscillation, the non-isochronous sensory input can actually give rise to a stronger rhythmic response from the network because of the contribution of the internal model. And that's sort of a proof of concept idea for the things I've been laying out earlier in the talk. Okay, so now for the last part. Kartikeya Kaushik is a master's student and research assistant in the group, and he's gotten really interested in the fact that most formalisms for language consider the end state representation, not the representational status as extended in time. So he's been working on a set and category theoretic description of how grammatical sequence of words can relate to grammatical syntactic structures. So far, he can express that rules of grammar are discoverable based on abstractions made over a set of constituents. And to describe that, it's the category theoretic notion of push out here that's used as glue between sets of linguistic representations, here words and phrases over time. So you can see that evidence for membership of an equivalence class Q is incrementally obtained for each set TI star. So here, I guess we start from TI and then we go 2, 3, 4 over there. Then you see that the grammar is simply a way of identifying or restricting valid structures from the infinite set of possible structures. But now that process, because it's done over each set, is now being extended in time and not just the end state. So we simply do that by, rather than evaluating the expression at the end, you do it incrementally at each sort of stage of phrase structure derivation that you've then denoted with these different sets. And we're hoping that this formal device will give us a way to begin to include a notion of time. It's of course not identical to time because we don't really even know what time is, but in any case, we use it as a proxy as how we think of time in cognitive science as a way to evaluate things incrementally, which we know is such an important principle from psycholinguistics and from the neurobiology of language as well. So using this, then we can allow us to build up a mathematical description of how a given syntactic structure relates to a given sequence of words. And I think that's going to be really valuable for future modeling endeavors when you want to start with, okay, what is the formal thing I'm trying to express? And then how can I specify that such that I can then implement it if I want to? Okay, again, now we get over my memory issues and go to the next slide. Okay, I'll close now by quickly summarizing the theoretical model that I've been developing over the last 5 years. Here, the main claim of the original version of this model is that knowledge of language is combined with the speech signal or with sign via gain and inhibition by packaging information in time, which is what leads to these rhythmic signals in the brain. My goal was to try to explain how hierarchical structure and compositionality might arise in a neural network bounded by known computational mechanisms in neuroscience, while taking into account things like incrementality. So this model has a distinct analysis by synthesis flavor. The latest incarnation of the model is in JOCN, and it takes a more sort of computational neuroscience bend with manifolds. And the core claims of this version of the model is that linguistic structure arises in the temporal dynamics of neural networks and is still a form of perceptual inference. And sensory percepts cue this internal model of language. Everything in play is a distributed code. The temporal distribution of these activation patterns results in functionally linguistic structures. So see also the work with Alex Dumas. And it's gain modulation and crucially inhibition. These are the assembly level computations that produce the pattern of dynamics that are the representations of linguistic structure from the sensory input. And in the paper, I have a pseudocode, a glossary, and a range of predictions. So then within this model, you can describe linguistic representations as trajectories in a manifold that render linguistic structure building as an expression of coordinate transform, which is an operation in systems neuroscience that repeats across the brain. But now for us, it's going to be multiplexed in time. All right, so now let me leave you with some good boundaries. We want a future where we can explain how language becomes algebraic through statistical experience and abduction over that experience, and in which we can discover the properties of the language system in the mind and brain while staying faithful to all the things that I've waxed on about. How do we get there? So here's some things that I think are important for the way forward. So again, mutual constraint from all of our involved disciplines. Focus again on what are the minimal claims about representation that we have to face, so that we need structure and statistics. How do we represent both of those? We want to ground our models in formal and conceptual analysis. And then I think also situating our computational theories within what we know about network computation in the brain is super important. Again, I can't seem to ever advance my slides. All right. Okay, these are other things just to keep in mind. So I think that independent or orthogonal evidence for a given computation beyond a particular brain region or beyond a particular model is always needed. So we really want to say, like, okay, because of multiple realizability and Kolmogorov complexity, what evidence do we have that this is really the computation that's at stake? We want to be able to generalize our predictors of brain activity, especially, but also behavior beyond particular tasks and experimental paradigms. And again, this pushes us more, I think, to sort of try to brain notions from linguistics and psychology more than just localizing box models. And that, I think, pushes us to really reimagine concepts like syntax and semantics and neural terms. And so I think as complementary integrated information that, although we can describe it formally in formally separable systems, they may not be fully independent or orthogonal to the brain. I think that more and more. And also to move away from a modularist view of neural networks and a modularist view of the brain. I think that's also key. And again, when we're doing our modeling, we have to be strict with ourselves and say that our successful predictions are not explanations, that good model performance isn't evidence that what we think is being learned or used is actually what's there, and that it's human-like or brain-like in any way. And again, all back to multiple realizability here. So in sum, I think what I want to do, and what I hope I've convinced a lot of people also to want to do, is that we should try to compute structure and be guided by statistics and come up with good theories about how either and both can be represented in a system. We want to incorporate time and rhythm into our models. And again, spoiler, I think phase synchronization and network dynamics are structure and meaning in the brain. All right, thank you for your attention. That's it, thank you. And I'd like to thank my group as well.